This is Nathaniel Schaefer's project for Linguistics 200, Language and Contact, Multilingualism in Scotland. The focus of this video documentary will be regarding the Highland clearances and the consequences on linguistic diversity in the Scottish Highlands, specifically regarding Scottish Gaelic. Of course, to understand the reasoning behind the current linguistic landscape of the Highlands, one must understand the history that created said landscape. The Scottish Highlands is an area well known in the tourism world for its picturesque beauty and charming small towns, but the Highlands have a deep and rich history that is often underanalyzed and only looked at through a superficial lens under the pretense of something I like to call window shop tourism, where tourists will get a glimpse of a historical event, then go get a glimpse of a dozen others instead of gathering a deeper understanding of the true nature of the past events of the area. While admiring the Highlands' most famous attractions, including Orcott Castle, Glenafin Viaduct, Ben Nevis, and Loch Ness, if one were to listen closely, the languages being spoken throughout these attractions is predominantly English. But if one were to close their eyes and imagine what these places were like hundreds of years ago, a faint whisper may erupt from the thousands of voices that were silenced in the past, speaking a language now nearly forgotten to the people who now live in these lands. Hundreds of years ago, Scottish Gaelic reigned over the Highlands, with tens of thousands of speakers scattered throughout the lands. This is the historical and linguistical story of how political power converged to not just displace communities, but a culture, a language, and a way of life. This is the Highland clearances of Scotland. The Highland clearances took place between the mid-18th and the mid-19th century. The number of people cleared from the Highlands during this period is hard to estimate due to a variety of reasons, including poor record keeping in the regions, moderate to extreme poverty that was experienced by the individuals being evicted. Rough estimates can range anywhere from 70,000 to 120,000 Gaelic-speaking Scottish citizens that were relocated to the lower areas of rural Scotland, to the cities, to oversee European colonies, or to areas around coastal Scotland. The rationale of the Highland clearances is complex and involves hundreds of years of Scottish history and involves several cultural and political entities that have existed in Scotland for centuries. The Jacobites were a group of individuals who believed the power of the British and Scottish throne belongs to the Stuart line and to King James II. There were many cultural and political motives for this, including the split between Catholic and Protestants in the now United Kingdom, with King James II being the last Catholic king of the United Kingdom. The Jacobites, which had large numbers in the Scottish Highlands and upon Gaelic speakers, had multiple revolutions to varying degrees of success in attempts to restore the Stuart line to the throne of the United Kingdom. In 1716, the British government enacted the Disarming Act, an act aimed at disarming the Highlanders by banning several forms of weapons unless being authorized by the government. This act was ineffective, as the Jacobites continued to quell support for decades until their eventual defeat at the Battle of Culloden during the Third Jacobite Revolution of 1745. Following the Jacobite defeat at the Battle of Culloden near Inverness, the monarchy of the United Kingdom cracked down on Scottish Gaelic culture due to the rapid support of the Jacobite cause throughout some portions of the Gaelic communities. This is known as the Drax Act of 1746, banning the dressing of men in traditional Scottish dress, such as the kilt or the tartan. This is not the only act that affected the Scottish Gaelic culture within Scotland. The Act of Proscription in 1746 added to the Disarming Act of 1745. These acts worked in accordance to criminalize and punish various other aspects of the Gaelic communities and Highland cultures, greatly weakening both Scottish and Gaelic traditions throughout the Highlands. Famous Gaelic wartime poet Alistair MacDonald, or in English Alexander MacDonald, was a soldier in the Jacobite army and wrote poems in Gaelic. He was with the Jacobites during their defeat at the Battle of Culloden. He can be quoted in one of his poems as writing, which in English can be roughly translated to, "Our dress and tartan will both be stripped from us, and black coats forced on us to mock us." In my opinion, I believe this can encapsulate the feelings of what can be felt by the Scottish Gaelic people during that time. The feelings of vulnerability and helplessness due to what they have been perceived as a foreign power, that being the King of England from a faraway land pushing rules onto the public domain of a people group who they have biases against. The Scottish Gaels likely felt as though they had no other choice but to obey what the British monarchy was putting upon them. Scotland had a unique agricultural tradition of crofting, which is essentially micro-farms where a landlord owned the land and rented it out to the tenant of the croft, where the tenant then worked the land the croft was located on, guaranteeing income for both the landlord and the crofter. These crofts were not always the way that agricultural land was divided within Scotland. Previously, the system of bailies was used, a system where someone known as a tacksman would lease the land to a tenant to make a profit. The tacksmen were not the owners of the land, but a manager. The owner was usually a clan chief or a laird, and the tacksman was often a relative of the chief. For political and economic reasons, crofting was becoming more popular within the Highlands, where families, or sometimes whole communities, were forcibly evicted to make more room for the more economically important sheep. The croft-making process was only accelerated following the defeat of the Jacobites, where the government and the crown began to take control of the Jacobite lands and consolidate them into larger crofts, making more room for sheep and agricultural land and less room for the people who have lived there for many centuries. For the tenants of the croft, the rent greatly increased from what it was in the past, which could outprice families who have been living on the plot of land for decades. Not only was the government creating crofts themselves, land that was still in the ownership of the clan system of Scotland also followed the path. Many of the clan chiefs decided it was more economically profitable to have less people on their land and more sheep. Once evicted, the people were being forced to the cities, the lowlands, or the coasts of the Highlands. It was also very common for people to be moved to the coasts to work in the kelping industry, kelp being a source of potash and iodine once melted. Once moved to the coast, they also worked in the fishing industries. A potato famine in the 1800s and the downfall of the kelping industry led to disaster in the new Highland coastal crofting communities, which led to mass migration out of the Highlands to other areas of Scotland, but then also international migration to Canada, the USA, Australia, and New Zealand. This is a panel from the Museum of Island Life in the Isle of Skye. It is estimated that nearly 7,000 people emigrated from the Isle of Skye to other areas of the world due to the Highland clearances. Of those 7,000 people, it is very likely that many of them did not reach their final destination. Of the people who did leave, Carolina was a very popular area for them to settle. By 1790, it was estimated that upwards of 2,000 people had already emigrated. As stated previously, it is hard to estimate the amount of people who were cleared during the clearances, but it can be estimated anywhere from 70 to 150,000, with some other estimates in my research being as high as 200,000 people being forcibly evicted from their homes. The people who left the Highlands were often Gaelic speakers and took the Gaelic language with them. An example of this is the Gaelic-speaking people and communities that have been established in Nova Scotia, Canada. Even though Nova Scotia is over 4,000 kilometers away from Scotland, it is estimated today that there is approximately 2,000 Gaelic speakers who reside within the province of Nova Scotia. That is a testament to the resilience of the Gaelic language and the people of Scotland. Nova Scotia currently houses North America's only Gaelic college, which offers classes and programs on Gaelic crafts, culture, music, and tradition. Along with this, a Highland village is located in Nova Scotia, promoting itself as a living history museum and folklore center that celebrates the story, language, and living culture of Nova Scotia Gaels. The reasoning behind the large scale of Scottish immigration to Canada is because of the Hudson Bay Company and the large amounts of immigrants to Nova Scotia by Gaelic speakers during the Highland clearances, where they established communities throughout the province, and then following that, the subsequent migration occurring to these Gaelic communities by Gaelic speakers in the decades to follow due to the improved quality of life and an improved ability to participate in the local economies. The number of current Gaelic speakers in Nova Scotia is a far cry from the estimates of the past, with Nova Scotia having over 5,000 Gaelic speakers recorded just a mere couple decades ago. But when Canada first became a country, Gaelic was the third most spoken language in Canada, only behind English and French. Gaelic was even the mother tongue of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. There was a bill put forward in Canada's House of Commons in 1890 to make Canada's third official language Scottish Gaelic. Though unsuccessful, I think it is fascinating to think about the way this would have affected modern-day Canada. I would theorize that there would be a much larger proportion of Gaelic speakers on the east coast of Canada. Would this bill have passed, their mother tongue would have been passed on to their children. The Gaelic would have been promoted more in schools and in government policies, possibly leading to another nationalist pseudo-nation in Canada, similar to the way that Quebec currently is. I think it is very interesting from a linguistic point of view that after forcibly being removed from their homes, the Gaelic language managed to thrive for decades across the world. Not only that, but some aspects of Highland culture is still very prevalent throughout modern-day Canada, with kilts and bagpipes still being used on special occasions throughout Canada and the Anglosphere by Scottish descendants. Many place names in the Anglosphere come from Gaelic origins. In fact, one of Canada's biggest cities is derived from a Gaelic word, Calgary, or Calgary if you're from there, is from the Gaelic word Cala-Gedi, which can be translated to beach of the meadow or bay farm, but modern-day Calgary is named after Calgary Castle, also known as Calgary House, located on the Isle of Mull in the Scottish Highlands. The Highland Clearances is partly responsible for the spreading of the Gaelic language and Highland culture to other areas of the world, but is also partly responsible for the decline of Gaelic speakers throughout modern-day Scotland. That being, along with a multitude of other reasons, such as government policy and societal taboos. Some modern societal taboos regarding Scottish Gaelic is that it is a barbaric language not to be spoken outside of family settings. The belief that speaking Gaelic is something to be ashamed of. Those have both greatly affected the remaining Gaelic-speaking communities in Scotland. Following the Highland clearances throughout the 1700s and 1800s, the amount of Gaelic speakers remaining in Scotland at the end of the 1800s was roughly 250,000 speakers, or 6% of the Scottish population, which is a far cry from the language that used to be the lingua franca of Scotland and the region a mere 4 or 5 centuries ago. Nowadays, the Gaelic language has seen a slight incline in recent years, but roughly 69,000 inhabitants of Scotland reported knowing the Gaelic language, or about 1.5% of Scotland's population, which is largely concentrated in the islands and the highlands of Scotland. Even though Gaelic is currently seeing a rebound, it is still in sharp decline from the numbers just a mere century ago. The decline of Gaelic in Scotland is a sore subject for the remaining Gaelic speakers of Scotland. From my own personal experiences in Scotland and the conversations I've had or listened to by Scottish citizens in the Highlands and the Islands, such as with Turlough at the Eile House in Stornoway, they seem to feel as though the decline of the Gaelic language coincided with the decline of many aspects of the Highland culture, which makes complete sense because language and cultural practices heavily influence one another and are usually tied together. Scottish Gaelic used to be the main language spoken throughout Scotland many centuries ago. The modern range of Scottish Gaelic, with strongholds being located on the islands of northwestern Scotland, like the Isle of Skye and the Isle of Lewis or Harris. In the past, Gaelic stretched throughout the Highlands, and going far back enough, it was even widely spoken throughout the lowlands a millennium ago. Mere centuries ago, the British and other English speakers sought to disrupt the status quo with the introduction of legislation banning many aspects of Highland culture, including traditional dress, along with the prosecution of those who spoke Gaelic following the Third Jacobite Revolution. These led up to the Highland clearances, which forcefully evicted tens of thousands of Scottish Gaelic speakers to make room for the more economically important sheep farming. It is within my opinion that without a doubt, the Highland clearances were not only about the economics of sheep farming, but rather a disguise to systematically dismantle both Scottish and Highland cultures and the Gaelic language itself, as both a punishment by the British for resisting their rule for many years, but also the fact that the British have a long and extensive track record of genocide and eradication of cultures across the world. To commit a genocide against the Gaelic people, to have them submit to the British rule, is exactly what they did to indigenous populations in Canada, the USA, Australia, and New Zealand. Even with many attempts to eradicate their culture and language, the Gaelic community has persisted throughout, and recent numbers show that the Gaelic language have had growth in the last decade. This can be partly due to government initiatives such as Gaelic broadcasting, Gaelic medium education, and Gaelic being used in public services. The Scottish people are a strong and determined group of individuals. Even though adversities have dampened both Gaelic culture and language, I do believe that growth is being made and Gaelic still has a place in modern-day Scotland and the world as a whole.